everybody, what's up and welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Liz, your host here at Crimes Untold, and today we're going to kick off Spooktober with, I don't know what the fuck that was, but you're welcome. We're going to kick it off with the Thames Torso Murders. So the Thames Torso Murders occurred between 1887 to possibly 1902. There's also an earlier case in there that we're going to be talking about, but first part of this, we're going to be talking about the canonical four. So the canonical four happened between 1887 and 1889. And I know you're probably thinking, canonical four, where have I heard that before? Well, you've heard that before with Jack the Ripper. So these murders are around the same time as Jack the Ripper. So it's really like these were kind of like swept under the rug. Here comes Jack the Ripper, and nobody really thought much of the Thames Torso murders. And then everything was, hysteria with the Jack the Ripper murders. I digress. Anywho, so we're going to be talking about the Raynham mystery, the Whitehall mystery, the Pinchin Street Torso murder, and the murder of Elizabeth Jackson first. Those are the canonical four. Elizabeth Jackson is the only victim that was identified out of all of these. In addition to these four, we have the remaining mysterious cases that have been linked to these. So we have the Battersea mystery, the Tottenham Court Road / Bedford Square mystery, and then there's the Les Mystères de Montreux and the Lambeth mystery. Yes, mouthfuls. So technically, if you think about it, those are five more, but two of them are put together because of how close they were found, and that is the Tottenham Court Road discovery and the Bedford Square mystery. And I will be discussing these 4/5 after the canonical four. So let's just jump into the first four, shall we? So starting with the Raynham mystery. So our first part of this is a discovery of remains found between May and June of 1887. This was in the Thames River near Raynham, and this was a horrifying discovery of female remains and when they were found. So it was workers in the area, they discovered a bundle, and this bundle was the torso of a woman. So periodically between May and June, more body parts were found, possibly from the same body. Of it, would have been difficult for a medical examiner at the time to complete an actual autopsy because of the way that they found the remains. And all in all, it was determined that whomever chopped up this woman had no medical knowledge due to the body having not been properly dissected. There was no way to determine the cause of death, and also there was a panel of jurors that, when they were discussing this case, they could only formulate that she was found dead. That was about it. The Whitehall mystery. About a year and a few months later, there was remains of a woman found within 3 separate locations of the city center between September 11th and October of 1888. One site was actually the police headquarters. Another would be the future home of Scotland Yard. Interesting, right? In very, very lucrative places that these body parts would be found. So part of her was found on the shore of the Thames River in Pimlico. I think it's called Pimlico. So Pimlico on September 11th. This was her shoulder and her right arm. It initially was thought that the arm was just a prank by medical students, but after the discovery of her left leg at the construction site of where Scotland Yard's future home would be, they were left with the thought that possibly this was not, and that this was connected to the Raynham mystery. Who is this female? And why are they doing this? These are questions that they had. Next was another arm that would be discovered on the side of the road on the 20th of September. And finally was a torso that would be found. So her torso was found on October 2nd of 1888. This was at a construction site in Westminster found by a construction worker. Now her torso was wrapped up and put in an unfinished vault. This construction site would be the new site of the police headquarters, and this discovery was viewed in a way of the killer taunting the police. This dismembered set of remains would be looked over by Dr. Bond and Dr. Hebert, plus a few other medical professionals were brought in by the police to help assist those two. It was determined that possibly whoever committed this had some medical knowledge due to the possible use of a tourniquet There was evidence found to prove this too, and the tourniquet was thought to have used prior to her being dismembered. Like there was evidence on her limbs, or what was remaining of the limbs. This woman was also aged to be about 24. There was no cause of death determined, and this woman was well nourished, and she was of a technical large stature, so she was a larger woman. She was never identified. Next up, we have Elizabeth Jackson. So this is the only body that has an identity attached to it, as I previously mentioned. So her torso was discovered on June 4th of 1889. 3 young boys were playing by the Thames River, and they saw something lying against an embankment under the Albert Bridge. They would be absolutely astonished and horrified when they found a human arm. What's kind of more disturbing about them finding it is the fact that when they found it wrapped up, they actually brought it to the police, so they picked it up and they brought it to them. This arm was then examined by Dr. Kempster, and it was determined to only have been in the water for maybe 24 hours. Also, the fabric that was, used as the wrapping paper for this arm had the name L.E. Fisher embroidered on it. But that wouldn't be the only part of her found. And soon after, more of her remains would be found in the river the following week on June 11th. That is when the thigh of her left leg was found in Battersea. The lower part of her abdomen was found in Horsley Down that day. On June 13th, a portion of her upper half was found in Battersea Park, plus her neck and her shoulders were found off of the Battersea. So potentially it was just like her ribs. So collarbones down to her ribs was found in Battersea Park, and then her neck and her shoulders were found in Battersea. On June 14th, there was another part of her left leg and her left foot found in Limehouse, and a part of her right leg and right foot were then found in Battersea. So he's just leaving, it's like a crumb trail of body parts basically, which is kind of disgusting to say, but very true. On June 15th, in Bankside, this is when the left arm was found, including the left hand. Her pelvis and her butt cheeks were found in Battersea, and her right thigh was found on a Chelsea embankment. On June 16th, this is when her right arm and hand were found in Bankside. So following the discovery of all of this, this is when the medical examiner issued the statement that whomever committed this dismemberment had absolutely no knowledge in the medical field. This was determined because this potentially could have been. They had roughly some knowledge, but not to the extent of a surgeon. So the medical examiner at the time, at first look, when seeing all these parts, it doesn't look like somebody actually knows what they're doing. But potentially it could have been a knacker or a butcher. And I had to look up what a knacker was because I was like, what is that? So a knacker is somebody that actually removes carcasses from a farm, so dead animals and stuff, after they've been slaughtered. And this is potentially a good way for a person to see exactly where remnants of something is cut apart. Really disgusting, but true. So the only part of this body that was never found was the head. And unfortunately so, what else is odd about this is that this woman was actually 8 months pregnant at the time of her death. This was deemed a murder, and she was fortunately identified as that of Elizabeth Jackson, who was a prostitute who was homeless and living in Chelsea. She was working in Soho Square at the time of her death. She also was a native of Cork County, Ireland as well. So what's also interesting about her death is that the part of her thigh that was found was actually thrown over the wall of Mary Shelley's estate. Mary Shelley is the author of Frankenstein, and this also was determined to be taunting, if you will, kind of like a calling card, oh, you want to find more? Here. And threw it on Mary Shelley's estate. So kind of gross, but kind of cool at the same time. I know, I'm a disturbing human being. Anywho, it fits right in with Spooktober. Next, we have the Pinchin Street Torso Murders, or murder. So this murder has been cross-referenced with Jack the Ripper. Constable William Pennant was walking on Pinchin Street on the 10th of September of 1889, and this is when he discovers something that he would not normally find. So this was about 5:15 a.m., and he found a woman's torso with the arm still attached under the arch of a railway in Whitechapel. I know, Whitechapel, you're thinking, whoa, Jack the Ripper times. Yes, this was quickly attributed to Jack the Ripper, but let's get into this discovery, shall we? This woman was estimated to be between 30 to 40, and she was never identified. Nor was the remainder of her body ever found, just the arms and the torso. It was determined that she was beaten relentlessly prior to being decapitated and dissected. She had damage to her abdomen, but she had no damage to her genitals, which is interesting. Her parts were also stored, which was something that they hadn't seen yet, and she was brought to where the torso was discovered. So a lot about this murder is reminiscent to Jack the Ripper because of being murdered and then placed somewhere, but she also wasn't as mutilated as those murders or as the other torso murders, so this is kind of like strange. She also was never identified, and she would be buried in East London Cemetery. So this case in particular was actually thought to have been connected to another murder, and that is of Alice Mackenzie in July of 1887. I will be discussing that murder in a separate video, but it was never definitive whether or not they were actually related. Like I mentioned, there were similarities that they questioned themselves about of whether or not this is another Jack the Ripper murder, but that was never fully panned out. They didn't understand, they couldn't determine whether or not it was related or not. So all of these discoveries of these bodies raised multiple red flags and many questions. Was it a medical professional? Was it Jack the Ripper? Could it have been multiple people? Who are these people? We know Elizabeth Jackson, but who the fuck are the rest? Did they want to dismember them? Did the perpetrator dispose of them on purpose? Did they know their victims? Did they choose them at random? Why did they choose them at random? Why did they dispose of them where they did? Is it familiar hunting ground for these people? Why are they using calling cards? Why are they just throwing body parts? I mean, they're just like flinging them like a wild animal flings their dung. Like, it's weird. Why did they choose Mary Shelley's estate? Why did they plant them in front of the future home of Scotland Yard? Why in front of the future building of police headquarters? Like, why did they choose these distinguishable places? I don't know. Many, many questions are left unanswered with these. But let's get into the other cases that are related to the Thames Torso murders, or attributed, we shall say. There is the Battersea mystery. So this is a culmination of two completely unsolved murders, in which parts were found on the 5th of September of 1873 and June of 1874. So this actually happened prior to the canonical four. So the first finding was that of the left part of a woman's trunk, which is the head, arms, and legs, but technically it was just of her torso. It is oftentimes labeled as her trunk, but it's just of her torso. Soon after, her right breast was found, so her right breast was indeed cut off of her torso, and her right breast was found in 9 Elms. Plus, more of her body parts, such as her right thigh, a tattered set of lungs, and right shoulder would be found. This is the first time we have seen an organ taken from the body and completely separate. In Woolwich, the pelvis was found. In Limehouse, her head was found, but not a full head. In particular, it was her scalp and her face attached to her scalp, kind of like a death mask. In Battersea, her left forearm was found. Ultimately, she was almost completely rebuilt, which is kind of odd to say, but it was completely accurate because, I mean, they kept finding these body parts and they were literally just like putting them on a table and putting the pieces together, if you will, kind of like Frankenstein. That kind of actually makes more sense now as to why there was a body part left at Mary Shelley's estate. Anywho, I digress. So from her face and head, obviously I mentioned she was scalped, but on her face, her chin and her nose were cut off. So it was still attached, like the skin is still attached, but this was cut out and so was her nose. So maybe she had something like an identifying marking on her face as to why they cut it off. I don't know. So quite literally, I mentioned that her face was basically a mask cut from her head, and it was just found floating in the river. Yeah, kind of like a Halloween mask just disposed of, but her face was literally just floating. So Thomas Bond, who was the acting chief surgeon for the Metropolitan Police for the area, also was able to direct Dr. Kempster, the police surgeon, to completely reassemble her, if you will. They were able to then deduce that what was missing from her body and what they had. So the report of her autopsy says just this: the joints were opened and the body was disarticulated. The joints at the hip and shoulders had been sawed through. The body wasn't hacked up, but was cut up in a way that showed precision and skill with the hands in a quick motion. The cause of death for this woman was determined to be that of blunt force trauma. This woman was determined to have thinner, short, dark hair. She was about 40 and she had a burn scar on her left breast. These are distinguishing markings, but nothing came of this lead anyway. Also, no hands and no skull were found or ever recovered to complete her remains either. This woman was then buried in Battersea Cemetery as an unknown. After her discovery and the reassembling of her body, there was a reward offered for information, and there was a jury that oversaw everything and determined that this was a homicide for persons unknown. The following year, in June of 1874, there was yet again another discovery. The body of a woman was found. Body is an understatement. So it was thrown in the water after one leg, both arms, and head were removed, so just her torso. Plus, her body was treated with lime. This case was never solved, and there was no cause of death ever determined. So when I read that her body was treated with lime, I quickly thought of the Cleveland Torso Murders, because most of those bodies were treated with a chemical agent that made their skin like leather, which is highly disgusting, but very smart to do, because it thickened their skin in a way that could basically make them into a doll, like a living doll, which also is more disgusting now that I think about it, but very true. Next up, we have the Tottenham Court Road discovery. So on October 24th of 1884, there was a chunk of flesh from the thigh and a skull found. The skull also had remnants of flesh still attached to it. So kind of like somebody had scalped this person, but there were still remnants. Around this time as well, near Tottenham Square, which is why this is connected, there was an arm found wrapped up in Bedford Square. So at about around 5 days later, on October 29th of 1884, at around 10 to 10:15, there was a torso found in a package at 33 Fitzroy Square. This was located by a constable. There was a woman's tattooed arm as well, draped over a railing near. And because this arm was tattooed, it was believed that this was a prostitute's body. So there also was a package, and this is the package I refer to at the beginning of this part, which is at 33 Fitzroy Square. So this package was in front of a military drill hall / armory, which is another place which is kind of like a taunting or a calling card, because this building was regularly like troops were everywhere, and military was everywhere. So they were literally like making their rounds around this building. So whoever placed this knew exactly when a guard would not be there. So this package in particular housed the torso that was found. And like I just mentioned, whomever placed this package had a knack for taunting the police and anybody in particular that would be near this building or anybody following these cases. And it was supremely reckless for them just to plant this in front of a military building. So back to the arm. The arm had a rose tattoo on it, and they thought that it would help in identifying her, but it didn't. So Dr. Lloyd, who was the divisional police surgeon at the time, helped with the autopsy and on some of the parts that were found. It was determined that this woman had been dead approximately 4 to 6 months prior to her discovery. The mutilation and dismemberment of the body took place post-mortem as well. After her dismemberment, it is said that the body is presumed to have been wrapped up like presents. Her face was damaged, and this is thought to have been completed just like first prior to the dismemberment, so like right after she died. Also, a fun fact, like I mentioned, her arm was hanging over a rail as a taunting mechanism. This dude really got his rocks off with this. So this This ended up with an inquest that was held at the Court of St. Giles Coroner, where there was evidence of these murders presented. At first, on November 11th, this is when it first was presented, it deemed that all of these parts that were found in both areas were deemed to be the same woman. But following this inquest, there was an additional one held on December 9th. With this inquest, they then formally introduced that these parts were actually from two different women, and these were then held as two separate homicides of persons unknown. They were never identified, and the remainder of the women were never found. This leads us to Le Mystère des Monstres and Lambeth Mystery. And I know I pronounced that wrong, the first one wrong, but it's because it's in Paris. This is the only one that is not in England. This is in France, and French is not my strong suit, so apologies. So there is no suspect that was ever identified or announced in these cases, and the same goes with these. On November of 1886, there was a mutilated torso found on the steps of the Montreux Church in Paris. So the right breast, the left arm, and the uterus were missing from this torso. So this is another body part that was missing. Interesting. Hence, another reason why it's connected. There was no right hand, legs, and the head was never recovered as well. So this murder, even though it took place in Paris, was attributed to the Thames Torso Murders in London. Ultimately, there was no inclination whether it was connected to those murders or if it was Jack the Ripper, or if it was Jack the Ripper's first victim, because 1886. This woman was never identified, nor was the rest of her remains ever found. Which brings us to our last case. So following this, there was another torso found on the 8th of June of 1902 in Lambeth on Salamanca Alley. So this discovery of a body of a woman who was mutilated, boiled, and charred is something we hadn't seen. And this was like the last one attributed to this. So this discovery was strange, to say the least. Her head and some of her remains were piled together, which were placed carefully. The upper portion of her body was laid upon the lower half of her body, which was her lower trunk. So pelvis to like her thighs and her feet. This woman is the only one with a distinct description, and this is the only crime that we have a possible look into her killer. So this woman was determined to have excellently taken care of teeth, not something we see in this time period. Prominently high cheekbones, she had a dark complexion, and she had straight dark hair. She was approximately 5 feet in height, and she was aged between 20 and 30. But even though she had excellently taken care of teeth, it is said that she was from a neglectful class, or neglectful poor class, meaning she was homeless. Her remains were found in the early morning hours of the 8th of June. This is when a man who worked for the Dalton's Works was going to a job site, and he was walking through Salamanca Place, and as he walked through the gateway corner at the end of Broad Street, this is when he saw a pile of the woman's remains with her head on top. And the way it's stacked is like similar to that of a cake. As to what I read, it was just like described as she basically was piled like a cake, like a cupcake. It kind of disgusting, but true. Her head was just like the cherry on top. Yeah. He also had passed through the same area at around 10 p.m. the prior evening, but he didn't see anything. But this is when description of our possible killer comes in. So there was another laborer that they questioned, and he said he saw a man the night prior with a woman at the gateway at about 10 p.m. This man was a foot taller than the woman, as the woman was standing, or seemed to be about 5 feet tall. This man had a cap, and he was wearing dark clothes. He wasn't wearing work clothes, he was wearing formal clothes. This woman had a white hat and with a black band on it, but this onlooker said he was about 12 to 14 yards away, and it was very dark when he saw this. So this is the only murder we have a description of the person, description of the woman who is unidentified, which you think all of that would help, but maybe she was a sex worker as well. So that is the Thames Torso canonical 4 murders, plus the other murders that are attributed to this case. I know it's a very strange one, but this one was really cool, and I wanted to include this in Spooktober because it's still unsolved. They have no idea who it was. Is this Jack the Ripper? Like, we don't know. We have no idea. Is this just a string of random people that were just taking and dissecting people? Is this a string of medical students who are just kidnapping people and killing them? We don't know. I don't know, honestly, if we will ever know at this point, because, I mean, the first murder happened in 1874 and the last one happened in 1902, and it's clearly 2023, and we still have no answers but one identified person. I'm sure if they recovered the remains, we could probably do genotyping or carbon dating of these people and reading exactly where they are from, because you can get that from their bones, which is cool. Due to how degraded their bones probably are and how broken down, they could probably do STR DNA or SRT DNA. I always say that wrong, but they possibly could do that. And I know I'm rambling, but that's just me in the morning as I've had 2 coffees. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys in my next one. And if you're listening over on Spotify, I hope you guys look out for my next episode that I have coming out at another time. So enjoy!